Okay, we're going to begin this second afternoon panel, which is the last that will be held at the Yale University Art Gallery. But we invite you to join us afterwards at Next Haven, where the keynote conversation between collector Bernard Lumpkin and artist Micheline Thomas will take place at 5:30. And the conversation, as we've mentioned a few times today, will be followed by a book launch to celebrate the release of the exhibition catalog for this exhibition. And that party, I should say, is generously sponsored, co-sponsored between Next Haven and the Yale School of Art. The current panel focused on the contemporary works in the exhibition with 3 of the contributing artists is moderated by Dr. Kimberly Pinder. She is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Dean of the Yale School of Art and is an internationally recognized scholar of race representation and public art. Dr. Pinder was appointed Yale's first Black woman dean in 2021. Prior to her appointment at Yale, she served as the provost and senior vice president, and then later acting president of Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Before her time in Boston, she was the dean of the University of New Mexico College of Fine Arts for 6 years, director and curator of the University of New Mexico Art Museum, chair of the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism, and director of that department's graduate program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dr. Pinder has also worked in museums and galleries such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Institute, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Dr. Pinder received her MA, MPhil, and PhD from Yale University. And now the artists. First, Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter is an award-winning Brooklyn-based multidisciplinary artist, advocate, and educator who creates socially conscious music, film, and visual art through an autobiographical lens. Although it has been a decade since her release from a Pennsylvania prison, Baxter's time spent in the carceral system continues to shape the direction of her art and practice. Baxter's work has been exhibited at prominent venues, including MoMA PS1, the African American Museum of Philadelphia, Frieze LA, Eastern State Penitentiary, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, among others, and most recently, she received her first museum solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum earlier this year. Our next panelist, Adia Millett, received her BFA from the University of California at Berkeley and an MFA from the California Institute of Arts. Millett's art honors the history of domestic craft, abstraction, and architecture while being inspired by Afrofuturism, emotional resilience, and the preservation of our land, and her work ranges widely in media, from painting, quilting, and glass to video, sculpture, and installation. She is a recent recipient of the Anonymous Was a Woman Award and a participant in the National Museum of Women in the Arts exhibition, Women to Watch. Her recent solo exhibitions were held at the California African American Museum, the San Jose Quilt and Textile Museum, and the Galerie du Monde in Hong Kong. She currently has a solo exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in San Jose and an upcoming show at the Haynes Gallery in San Francisco. And finally, Curtis Tallwaist Santiago lives and works in Munich. He has exhibited internationally at venues such as the Drawing Center and the New Museum, New York, the Eli and Edith Broad Museum at Michigan State University, the Institute of Contemporary Art at Virginia Commonwealth University, the Perez Art Museum in Miami, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, the Osage Gallery in Hong Kong, and various others. His works are in permanent collections of the National Gallery of Canada, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Nevada Museum of Art, and the Landbachhaus in Munich, among others. In 2021, Santiago was an artist in residence at Kehinde Wiley's residency program, Black Rock, Senegal, and is currently an artist in residence at Fountainhead in Miami. Please welcome Dean Kimberly Pinder and these three remarkable artists.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Well, great. Well, I'm really honored to be here, especially after seeing your work and not having met any of you in person. I think that's how many of us are experiencing you right now. So this is really great to have a chance to ask you about your work and also to talk more about your work in the context of the show. I'm gonna ask questions and then you can kind of go down the line. I hope that's okay. Unfortunately, Mary, I think you'll always be at the end then, but then you'll okay. Last but not least, right? I'd love for each of you to talk a bit about the work that was selected and curated into the exhibition, and how that particular work, and we're assuming now that most of you here have seen the show or at least seen images of it, how it actually fits within the broader, your broader art practice. So Curtis, you want to start?
Okay. I don't know if we have images or slides.
Yes. Oh, I'm supposed to be doing that, sorry.
No
I've already messed up my job.
problem, we'll find it. Okay, yeah. All right, so these are works from a series I've called the Infinity Series. And within the Infinity Series, there's branches. And this branch, if we just go back one, I'll stick on. This branch was created during my time in South Africa around 2017. Immediately upon arrival in Johannesburg, I took note of the elders going to work, coming from work, and this older generation that really spent the majority of their life under apartheid, just constantly in this state of activity, not seeing any sort of rest, even speaking to friends at homes, their parents just didn't know how to chill. My very first night, I was taken to the home of a young Afropolitan, and within the home, there was beautiful artworks and just this generation who, because of the sacrifices of their elders, now could be at rest. And so I thought while I was here, the focus of my work in the Infinity series would be finding these old antique boxes. This is from the Edwardian period, which would often be found in like older antique shops that existed during apartheid, and there'd always be this dance of them even just letting me in, and then recognizing that I'm North American, and then all of a sudden their energies would completely change. I wanted them to be housed in these boxes that were probably cleaned by black hands or felt impossible to see their lives depicted within them. And that is the Infinity series that I chose to show here. And the last part of the question is, in my broader scope of work, the Infinity series, specifically this series, is the one that got me in the game. When I first started presenting this to the art world, I'm a musician for most of my life. I'm primarily self-taught. I was laughed at. Galleries and spaces didn't think that these objects could hold importance. And I've just since returned to them after exploring painting, performance, and other mediums, because there's the essence for me of why I make art is to connect with people and to have that interaction, intimacy, sharing of stories. And my visual disappears completely to whoever I show when they see this and they begin to share intimate stories about their life. There's an intimacy exchange that is just by the nature of holding these objects that I've fallen deeply in love with.
What's your idea?
Let's see. So, you know, it's interesting. I keep hearing this word intimacy today in the conversation. And I think that miniature, small things in general have a tendency to require that, require you to get up close, to look inside, to have a different kind of peering into either an object or a photograph or into the eyes of a portrait. This piece here, I just wanted to kind of say that before I talk about this work. This piece here is actually an older piece from 2011 that I did in the last series of miniatures I did. I had been doing them for a while as someone who's a big fan and advocate of craft, miniature and dollhouse building literally was one of my starting points. And this piece in particular, I was so curious as to why Mickalene chose this piece. And then as I saw the show, it started to really make sense. This was created while I was living in San Francisco at a time when it almost seemed like there was this new form of colonialism happening, not just because of the tech world, but because of the changes and regulations around the selling and distribution of cannabis. So at that point, it was medical use and not recreational, but it was kind of like the wild, wild west. Everyone was trying to get in and be able to not be operating illegally. Coincidentally, the people who were not being given permits and allowed to do that were Black folks, which then took me back to so much of how early farming for Black Americans was given, land was given or sold to them, and then it was quickly taken away through having the land either burnt down, lynching. It was just an incredible removal. And so that and just thinking about, is there another image of this where you can see the inside of the space? A little bit there. But if you've seen the piece, basically there are trees, potted trees with money on them. So thinking about cash crops, thinking about the things that are in this kind of sterile indoor environment, and then there's these kind of pirate colonial ships that are kind of flying through the air around them. So that was I put most of the miniatures were domestic spaces. So wanting to think about this idea of what we as viewers project onto a character. So I kept thinking about the spaces as these characters, that we have this exterior of who we are, and then once we get to look inside, the different layers and experiences and stories that are revealed from that. So that kind of play with the domestic, with craft, and then this other layer of history that can be kind of excavated from inside of something. So I'll just start with that about the piece.
Okay. All righty. Well, I guess like much of my practice, my work is largely autobiographical, or me responding to a moment in my environment. So for this particular series, Consecration to Mary, I didn't go looking for the images that Thomas Eakins took. I just happened to be working in his home and home studio under another organization, Mural Arts Philadelphia, and it was during the pandemic, right? And 90% of the staff were working from home. At the time, I was the office manager and assistant to the COO. So I spent a lot of time with the building, and it was through mining some of my earlier works, looking at root causes of incarceration, adultification bias, but also mining the building and space that I was working in, that I learned that Thomas Eakins was in actuality a serial sexual predator, and that he had probably taken some of the first images of child pornography. And I came to this knowing through Saidiya Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, also through Deb Willis's and Carla Williams' work, and Fred Moten, about these two particular photographs in the series where there's an unnamed African-American girl between the ages of maybe 5 or 8, posed as the odalisque, which we all know in visual culture is a liken to a concubine, a prostitute, someone who is always sexually available. And for me, being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, the images touched me very deeply. I had a very visceral experience, and I felt implicated while viewing these images on the website of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts Online Museum Archive. And it was in that moment that I felt a responsibility to not only reimagine the images, but also to apply a certain level of critical care and redress and reimagine those moments safe and protected as they should have been.
Yeah. In the exhibition, all of your work is displayed alongside late 18th and early 19th century portraits of Black Americans and those who were part of the African Caribbean diaspora. How do you think about these historical connections to your work, and what histories or legacies do you feel that your work engages, including those implicated in the show and outside of it? I know that each of you have touched on, the context, sort of historical linkages in the work, but I think you could probably say a little bit more about the historical context as well, right?
I guess I can go.
No.
Well, for me, within the exhibition, what I see is this radical reimagining of Blackness, of personhood, that is absent of enslavement, subjugation, and stereotype. And essentially a level of autonomy. And we all know that children can't give consent. And this reclamation, as a part of my practice, I think really encapsulates that, right? Me wanting to take these images that are depraved of humanity, that are very violent, and making them suitable for someone to look at, right, and to engage with. Me coming in and combating like this predatory colonial gaze with care, right, and with wanting to reparent the figure, right, wanting to intervene in a moment of violence, essentially.
I think that's
I'll go for it. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that this is making me think about is less about just my piece or our pieces in relationship to the history, but more about what this exhibition does in terms of creating a dialogue between the past, the present, and the future, and between different creatives. I mean, this show is so much about the curator, about curators, about how this space is taken into consideration, how the viewer connects to the space, and how it kind of gives new life to to the contemporary artists, and lets us be seen from the light of these unvoiced women who, people from the past, that we get to see them we don't know people's names, and now we are building this conversation essentially with our ancestors in some way. So to me, that's where, as an artist, I'm like, curators, I want to do something. It's so inspiring to see the possibilities of curators, who I personally think are artists, and, come together with other artists and start a bigger dialogue where artists aren't just making art about one thing. We're just pushing it. There's all these deep, beautiful connections. So I mean, I think it was so beautifully done, and it's got so much refinement, and is not afraid to look at a part of history that I think we often want to kind of put in a little box and keep closed. Yeah.
A combination of what you both said. I think about, like we've heard so much about genetic trauma, and right at the point when I was heading to South Africa, Trump was being inaugurated. The day of his inauguration, I was on a plane out. That summer, we'd seen Philando Castile murdered on Facebook, and I had just started living in the United States. It felt like a lot of the work was a response to that. And I was in my kind of disasters of war period looking at Goya. And so when I got on the plane, when I got to South Africa, I just started thinking about genetic imagination and like the idea of these ancestors. So now to see the works, these works, which again, when I was called to say say, these are the pieces, Keely and McLean were like, these are the pieces we want. I was like, yeah, but these aren't the hits. And then to see it in this exhibition, I'm like, those are the hits. The mundane moments we have of just at rest and again, that act of rest. But then seeing, like, if we go back to Mary's, the decoration and detail. Then you go to the lids of my dioramas. And then we go to that little jar of cotton on the back of yours. Care and consideration by the curator and the artist. That level of attention and detail and time put into consider all these things, and maybe you get lucky, you put things together, you're like, oh, you start to see it. But just that initial flame, that instinct that these would all work together, it has reframed my practice on now what I think are the important moments in works that I've made, and how paired with the right exhibitions, because these have now become commodities, where they're the fair darlings, and it was so refreshing for that not to be how they're viewed, and especially these figures and these people. So, yeah.
I love that we're hearing, care and consideration, and I think that relates to the next topic that I wanted to talk about when you're mentioning the intimacy, and I love how you used the phrase earlier, the intimacy exchange with these small objects. And that's where, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this book, this ancient book. It's 30 years old. It's interesting that I'm back here. As you heard, I got my PhD here, and this was a big book in graduate school for the 90s, those of you art historians out there. And I had to really dig around for this, but again, when I was revisiting my experience in the show and how it's so much about intimacy, I remembered that this book by Susan Stewart called On Longing had an entire chapter on the miniature. And so I went back and started reading about that. And there are a few phrases I'm just going to mention and then have you all respond. That relates a little bit to what you were just saying in terms of also temporal displacement when going deep into the intimacy that blocks out space as you get closer and closer into these smaller environments. So here's one thing that really struck me. The miniature, for the function of the miniature here, it is to bring historical events to life, to immediacy, and thereby to erase their history, to lose us within their presentness. And I love how this phrase about the transcendence that is presented by the miniature in a spatial transcendence. How again this collapse of time and space because of what you physically have to do with a small object, whether it's the daguerreotype or this wonderful jewel box, or peeping into your dollhouse. So I wondered if you could respond a little bit to that with your work.
Well, for me, utilizing the daguerreotype was a deliberate choice, right? Thinking about, again, intimacy and the inability, right, for children to have language around sexual violence. So the ability for them to, open up and share as much as they can, but when it becomes overwhelming and too much, allowing them to stop. And, I was speaking to a group earlier. I think it's true for anyone on a healing journey. It's not linear. There's a lot of stopping and starting. Another reason for the daguerreotype, I'm thinking in terms of materiality, the toxicity, right, of those chemicals that is needed to produce a daguerreotype, and how that can be a metaphor for the weaponization of Eakins' lens upon the young girl, but just photography in general, since its inception, being weaponized against the Black body. So for me, yeah, having that intimate encounter is imperative.
Something also about, is this one?
Yeah.
About scale that really kind of suggests power, a power dynamic, right? There's this idea that with a dollhouse, for example, that you, a child or whoever's playing it with it, gets to determine what's happening in this little setting, or something that you can open and close. There's a power relationship between the looker and the object, and I know in the case of with the miniatures, you can imagine yourself entering the space, but you don't actually have access to that space. And I know there's this moment as I was doing those where I started to make the rooms life-size so that you could walk inside, because I wanted to see how we could push that boundary while still going into a space that's not real. It's still based on all of the things that we project into it, you know. So it's definitely a power dynamic thing that we're talking about.
I also found, I love that I had your work in my mind and then going back through this whole chapter about miniatures, because there's a whole section on the dollhouse. We were talking about this being this old book that really dates us, but it's really interesting. And again, what you were just talking about with the power dynamic, and also that, that tension between space and what you see and what you don't see with the dollhouse. And she says the dollhouse is a materialized secret. What we look for is the dollhouse within the dollhouse, and its promise of an infinitely profound interiority, which that infinitely profound interiority, I think, relates directly to the theme that is part of the conception of this entire show. Like, we are walking into an intimate and seemingly infinite interiority by this, the inside of a work of art that we are now stepping inside of, and then into another one with all of your works, and then to another world. It's almost like one of those funhouse mirrors, like we're just going deeper and deeper and smaller, right? Between small scale and then large scale, inside and outside. So how about you, Curtis?
I think about something that was said on a previous panel about the blip in time, the collapse of time. Like, we're looking at these images from the late 1800s that wasn't so far ago. And so when I'm now specifically thinking of these works from this neighborhood in Johannesburg that just a blip ago, no one would have imagined these black bodies owning the space. And so, and I think about, while we're up here, I'm thinking about the larger than life Nelson Mandela sculpture that we're supposed to go and visit and feel moved by. And what would the power be if it is something we could all hold with us versus this? And so I think about the power of a monument, and monument doesn't have to mean monumental in scale, and that these can act as a monument of, you said we couldn't, but here we are.
Yeah, and also another thing in this book about these, as well as the dollhouse and just the intimacy, also, you know, really allude to toys when you look at them, because you have to get so close to them. And again, I was so excited when I was thinking about your work, Curtis in particular, and this whole passage about toys and what they do to us. The toy, it presents the possibility of a self-invoking fiction. Again, that's about the control with the dollhouse, right? But also the control that you've given us with this interior. And another great line here is, it's a fiction which exists independent of human signifying processes. And I think I'd love for you, I was thinking again also of your other practice of fantasy and alter egos that go hand in hand with toys, because they help us make new worlds. They're about world building. And I don't know if you're going to talk about your alter ego a little bit later, but
Yeah, I can definitely.
are you going to mention a little bit now?
Yeah, so the alter ego was also created right around this time. Sir Dingole. He is a time traveling knight, kind of like a Don Quixote type character. Dingole in Trinidad. I grew up as a very shy kid, and so we'd go to cultural events. I grew up in a predominantly white city, and so we had small pockets of Caribbean culture, and we'd go to these events, and grew up in the suburbs, so I'd be like on the sidelines while the kids could speak with the accents, and my mom would say, "Lewi dingole, loosen yourself up and be free with it." And so I created this character who goes backwards and forwards in time, connecting with real ancestors and imagined ancestors to help them with the problems to come and to remove the problems of the past. But it's all play, and you talked about as another child of survivor, one of the ways to get us to talk was you play and you reenact kind of what maybe if you don't have the language. And I still to this day, this is still play for me. Even though the subject matter can be, when I sit there with the materials and everything in front of me, it's all just this play. Whatever comes out, it processes from inside. It's still about play, like the same as I would when I was young. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So, as you all keep seeing, like the little teaser when it says additional work, right? Can we move on to that, right? Okay. Let's see here. We've asked all of you to bring an additional work or body of work into the discussion today. The big open the envelope here. Could you share with us why you selected this, as well as what ideas, connections, and considerations are factored into its creation and display? This is great. I also want to just make what we're really pointing out here, again, the terrible art historian's dilemma is the problem with inaccurate scale. Like I think all of us are like, wow, this is what I want to sit and look at, for a long time. I just finished teaching a class on public art, and I was just talking in the class about how we're looking at slides of objects that you're supposed to stand next to and walk around. And that's the dilemma with having to teach not from the actual objects. And here we have, all of you have this great experience that you can have today where you can see all of these details with this out of whack scale, but also go and see the real object. I just had to mention that because I feel like the dissonance of scale that we're talking about by seeing this very intimate work, humongous on the screen here. So go ahead.
I won't dive too much into this because I think I failed on the assignment. This is connected
No
to,
grades.
this is again from the same body of work from my time in South Africa, and it was a depiction of, if you ever have an opportunity, just Google Durban Beach at Christmas. And here you have from the lid, I thought it was so fitting, this Edwardian couple just strolling, because the beaches in Johannesburg or in Cape Town, everyone's allowed to go, but it's not the most welcoming space for the black body, but Durban Beach is. And so I wanted to depict this absolutely one-of-a-kind, amazing beach scene that happens there specifically around Christmas. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Mary?
Okay. With these particular works, I'm really trying to challenge this notion that Black children aren't cared for, and utilizing my own personal experience with Black precarity as it pertains to the birth of my child. So for those that don't know, during my incarceration period, I was pregnant and was forced to be shackled for 43 hours while in labor with my son. So I'm speaking to the precarity of that, but then also the place where this still is taken. It's from a musical documentary or musical film entitled Ain't I a Woman? it's staged at Eastern State Penitentiary, which is about 2-3 blocks away from Thomas Eakins' home, which is now Mural Arts, a public arts organization. But the little known history of Eastern State Penitentiary is that over 900 children, predominantly black children, were incarcerated at Eastern State Penitentiary. And the youngest person to die in the institution was a black girl by the name of Mary Ash at age 11. So I guess how it's in conversation, Consecration of Mary is still like looking at this precarity of black life, particularly in the lives of our children, and how mass incarceration, which is an extension of slavery, is a reproductive justice issue for black women, I feel. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay.
And I think we all want to express, like what you just revealed, and thank you for surviving it and bringing it to us. And
Thank you. Oh, another interesting fact, at Eastern State Penitentiary, what people fail to realize, when you go to prison, you still have all of the societal issues that follow you in there. So misogyny, sexism, racism, those things don't fall away because you're in an institution. They're actually heightened. So in the time of Eastern State, when women were also incarcerated there, they were not allowed to utilize the hospital. So a lot of women actually gave birth in their cells. So that was another deciding factor of why I felt it was important to include that location in my musical documentary.
thank you. I think that also brings up, what we're talking about with the miniature, but all this idea of sight, that is so important because, as we all know, just even being in a place like this, on a campus like Yale, that sites are embedded with histories, good and bad, and trauma, and they are all around us when we are in a place. And it's good for us to always be remembering that. All right, next.
I feel like, Mary, we're not done with what you just shared, and trying to think about how do I connect, how can we talk about all of our work in relationship to that. And I think there's something about the unseen, the folks that we don't know their names and we don't acknowledge their existence, and specifically incarcerated people, but a lot of black folks, including ourselves. And I think as artists, we're trying to figure out a way to bring up these topics that for us shy kids, we couldn't do it in the traditional way of just saying it in words. And connection to what the image you're looking at here, this is an exhibition that I currently have up at the ICA in San Jose. And the connection is that this exhibition started from seeing a donated collection of African American quilts at the Berkeley Museum. So I saw these quilts, I started to learn about them, a lot of which the names of the quilters was unknown. So I think there's 3,000 pieces in that collection that was donated to them, and a very large missing history. And for a lot of quilters, it's not just one person sitting around doing a huge handmade quilt. It's a group of women, group of people in community. And I kept thinking about this lost, rich history and storytelling and healing that came through these collective pieces, and kept thinking of these women as warriors. So was like, how do I make a parallel between these craft forms and ancient warriors, ancestors that I don't know, but that I know I have a bloodline to? So the exhibition is that it's about crafts women in parallel to ancient warriors. So the show has quilting, glasswork, these kind of sculptural pieces. It has a sound piece made, which is a collaboration between myself and 3 sound artists. and then there's a big weaving piece that was developed by a weaver who was talking about her relationship to surviving cancer and that battle in relationship to other types of warriorship. So I guess the connection really is that there are so many voices that we as artists can kind of bring back into the conversation. You know, children whose photographs are, you know, being used for whatever morbid reasons they're being used for. These women whose work were taken from them from almost close to nothing, even though they were relics. I mean, these beautiful quilts should be honored and preserved, and so just knowing that we as contemporary artists can carry that on, you know, us trying to find different ways to carry the stories of people in the past, but also the people who are still living, and hopefully make a difference in how we're being supported. And I think a place like Yale, you know, has a very intense history. We were talking about that earlier, is, you know, wow, we're here at a place that we may not have been included in, you know, a few decades ago, and how just sitting in the audience watching the majority of the people on the stage being Black women, for me at Yale, I never would have imagined that. And so it's nice to see what's in the works and what's happening now currently.
Well, I always like to write down really important words that have come out here, and I think relating to what you're saying here is that, you know, what all of you are mentioning, how you're using your work to not only educate people, but to actually honor people and give voice and name people that are left unnamed. And I really love the phrase that you used, Mary, about reparenting. And when you think about it, you know, when you're addressing history and the opportunity that Keely and Micheline have given us in that exhibition is to reparent all of us in the education of history, to kind of raise us again, and anyone who comes into that space. You know, I always joke as administrators, sometimes there are difficult situations with difficult people, and I used to joke, I need to have like a birthing room where we can kind of start over, you know, with some folks. And, you know, as we often hear, you know, raise them right, you know, and so I really latched on to the reparent. Thank you, right, all of you, for offering us these tools for reparenting, all of us. About history, about who we are, about our relationship to each other and to our ancestors. I think now, what time is it? I don't want to dig for my phone. Do we have time?
4:45, so we have half an hour technically, left 15 for Q&A if you
Okay.
want to ask another question.
Okay. Well, I do have another question here. Actually, it's more about something that any of you have been in my class, you've heard me ask this question, and now I'm having my students ask it a lot of artists, is that you were delving into just what I was talking about, these traumatic histories, personal that connect historically to what you mentioned, also genetic trauma. And as artists, because again, I know I have some of our art students here in the audience, I'm always asking, with this material, how do you repair yourselves when you're so committed to addressing histories that are difficult, personal issues that are difficult, and giving them an entire, you know, theater and audience when you're sitting with that? And I know that there's obviously joy, like for instance in a number of their pieces, like yours is just chillin', you know. But I also would love to know what is your own, I don't only just call it self-care, but self-repair when you're committed to this material.
I guess
Go ahead.
for me, it is countering these images of degradation and finding Black joy in the moving image and the still image. So going through archives and specifically seeking out images that are I would say images that replenish the soul and remind me of my humanity and remind me that, you know, it's okay to have the tension of the other images, but to not be defined by the archives, right? And that's why, you know, in my work, I'm trying to reimagine that space. But also community, finding community in other artists that share commonality around experience and my spirituality. So as an artist, I also don't sell work. I believe that it's an extension of my spirituality and that the pieces that I make are invaluable. So those are some of the ways that I push back against the horrors.
What's next?
I think specifically with the miniatures, even when I was dealing with, let's say, the Disaster of War series where I looked at Porqué and the moments of Goya's Porqué where line up with, like, visually with the YouTube videos of Eric Garner. When I was constructing the figure, I have to touch it so many times, and it has to touch me. And if I'm true and authentic, and like it's coming from that good place, it resonates when it's made, and that is enough to, like, that is so, it's that spiritual aspect when I've touched something so many times and it finally sings or comes to life. That's like, oh, okay, that's it.
I mean, there's two aspects of this. There's that kind of the spiritual and the self-healing element. And I think on the spiritual level, I find that when you start to talk to artists about their process, sometimes there's this element of feeling almost like more of a conduit than an actual creator on your own. That, you know, that we are trying to listen to kind of the unseen or the unheard. And for me, that's where we all put a name to it, either if we have a religious practice or connected to our ancestors, whatever it is that kind of helps us to access what we make on a spiritual level. But I think on a kind of healing part, for me, as a crafter, as someone who actually is a maker, just the repetition of quilting or of stitching or of making something small is a meditation. It's a healing act, or even painting. You're doing it and you're processing all the topics that you're trying to address. And for me, I find that, like, painting abstraction in particular gives me access to get everything out of the way. There's something about facing an issue and then putting it aside. Like I always say when I meet with grad students, I always say, okay, this is great, but at some point you're gonna have to walk out of here and throw this all away for a second, and know that you don't just have to go by everything you learned. You have something bigger than that, because academia can just, like, give you these nice boundaries, a lot of ways that you can confine your practice. And I think that the real beauty comes from when the artist escapes that. There's so many artists that you're talking about that I saw their work 20 years ago and was like, oh, this is cool. And now you can see they walked away and they allowed it to expand. Yeah, and that's where healing happens too for all of us.
We'll open it up to Q&A now. We have a microphone here if anybody, and back there as well. Any questions for our three artists here today? Everyone's so shy. Really?
And the one back there is two. See three.
Oh no, we'll get you. No, someone's going to speak back there. We'll get to you. All right, there. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just walked in the door having been on the road and caught most of this by Zoom, which is fantastic. And I'm going to ask what might be the least esoteric question of the day. I'm a museum director, and my organization has multiple historic house museums. And so much of this sounds familiar, but sort of permutated a couple of notches, and I keep grappling with what that means and what it opens up. And the comment just a moment ago about abstraction and being able to just kind of see the contours of issues in new ways and get the rest of the clutter out of the way is fascinating. The question that comes to mind is that so much of this conversation has been really quite intellectual, and we can appreciate it on that level, but the day-to-day reality that I find myself confronting is what is the actual experience? Where's the transformation for all visitors? And certainly you can see it embedded in all of this and in what's been said about it. But I'd be really interested to hear the commentary on what comes through without any mediation, and where reasonable amount of mediation could unlock experiences that would be transformative for a public audience, to an art gallery that's fantastically free and open for people to walk in the door and into the galleries.
So that's a question for each of them about their particular work, like what doesn't need mediation, what's just immediate. Okay. Do you want to start, maybe?
I mean, for me, what comes to mind is Tina Kemp's work, A Black Gaze. And I think that my work exemplifies that as being like a spectator or a viewer and encountering these images by Eakins and being vulnerable enough, right, to one, allow myself to be implicated and feel responsible in some way to reimagine them, which, I went beyond the passive viewer as someone that actively made a critical intervention, right? I just didn't look and then look away. I looked and then I dug deeper and I moved forward in that direction. So much so to, there's an online petition, active petition, that is calling the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts into accountability for housing these sexually explicit images on their website after Sadia's work, after Fred's work, after Deb's work, and really, call into account, like, you have a responsibility as an institution of higher learning to scholarship, a fuller scholarship around Eakins, and all of the consequences of these images being out in the world, right? These images lets us know who's valued, who isn't, who's protected, who's deserving of protection. I think that's just one way that I was transformed by looking at the images, and it's something that I hope that spills over into the public. But again, it's the individual, right? They bring their own set of experiences and dissonance, and
Yeah, Mary, I would agree with you. I think for each viewer, there's a different access to transformation. I don't think the artist can really predict that. I do think that the artist can lead to some element of responsibility and creating something that has a social practice element, or something where the viewer can actually go out and do something. But that's not transformative for everyone. Some people don't, that's not the thing that's going to make them show up different in the world. So I think if for artists, it's a question of, how do I make this work a mirror? How do I make this a piece where the viewer has to look back at themselves? And that's where the potential for transformation, I think, can happen.
With my work, there's two things I think about from your question. The first one being, I'm willing to take the risk. If the institutions that I work with are willing to take the risk and not just think about insurance value and all these things, my work is meant to be held. The interaction we had, where you come in and you open it. Now, I've always been open to that. If something breaks, it breaks. It can be fixed. I wouldn't put it in old vessels. But if I want to trust and build that relationship with the audience my viewer, that when they hold it, they're holding the hands of so many other people. And maybe if that energy of all these other hands who look at this piece about a current issue that everybody's divided on, maybe somehow this collective energy might just be like, well, I don't know, that's kind of, maybe like wishful thinking. The other aspect is that it has to start in the studio. If I don't feel somehow transformed, really, when you hear Miles Davis's horn versus a million other horns, that's it. That it's not this rush from younger artists to be like, okay, well, I just got it, I got to show it. If I'm honest with myself and okay, these are ready. That's the best shot I have. But outside that, anything else is out of my control.
You have a question, sir?
I have a question for Mary. If you've experienced photography as so threatening or as so aggressive and negative, how do you transform it into something positive or healing or sheltering or protective? And is that answer embedded in the decisions of technology that you're making? Because you're not using the poisonous daguerreotype process, you're choosing a different process. What is your thinking or your experimentation as you arrive at your work?
I'm sorry.
Well, I'm wondering about how the methodology carries meaning, carries content, right? It's like when you're making these prints that imitate or simulate the daguerreotype, but they aren't really daguerreotypes. You're not doing that because...
Right, I think it becomes a metaphor of sorts because I'm actually removing literally the toxicity, right? I spoke a little bit earlier to the fact that, the daguerreotype, in creating those images, they use arsenic and all of these chemicals that and it's interesting through my research, I found that a lot of the men who were like husbands, fathers, uncles, took the photo, and a lot of women, wives, sisters, daughters, actually processed the images and were exposed. So I think by using, these new technologies of Photoshop and things like that, that I'm literally taking the toxicity out of it. And then again, like the metaphor for the way that Eakins has weaponized his lens or photography in general against the black body, by using these other processes, I'm literally taking the toxicity, the harm out of the process of making. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your panel. This is Jenny Parsons again. I'm a curator at the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme. And when I was looking at your works in person upstairs and then again here on the screen, I was noticing in different ways how they're each a challenge to see. Some of that is because of scale, but some of it is lighting. And I also wonder if some of it is intentionally thought through by each of you in the media themselves, such as with Mary, the daguerreotype, because of the chemicals and the way the lighting is, I found myself, moving around to try to see them from different angles to understand the images, and they're especially difficult to photograph, right? And so I wonder if that's something you have thought about, or if it's just my personal reflection. But I find it quite special, the fact that you do need to see them in person to understand them. But then what does that mean for others who won't experience them in person?
That's a good question. Yes, definitely deliberate choices on the lighting. Even the paper that I'm using is a reflective metallic paper. Having the low light, and then even some of the debris show up in the photo, I wanted it to speak to the time period, right? As if that intervention happened then, because it should have, right? These photographs should not live as they had prior to my intervention. And yeah, it's pretty much the thinking there.
I think shadows are underestimated. I think that we have a tendency to want things to be really well lit, and I think sometimes you can find so much more depth when things have darkness, when you can see the darkness and you see the shadows and you see the dimension in a different way. So I know with the miniatures, there's those lights are tiny and they're low lit and they have angles, and to me that even makes me think more about the absence of the figure, in some way, and how the figure or a ghost or something entering the space of a photograph or a space kind of shifts when you think of it from that lens.
Thank you so much. I was looking so much forward to this panel, so thank you for talking about your practice. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the miniature works, or like the small scale works that you do, and then the large. I mean, there's like with the examples that you, Adia and Mary have brought, there's a huge difference between having a blown up giant, what is it called, poster board? Billboard, thank you, billboard, or having a large scale abstract painting to what is presented in the show upstairs.
And the question is the difference?
The question is like, what is the relationship? Like, how do you, like, is there a specific, I mean, of course, with the daguerreotypes, there was a specific choice of medium because you were in conversation with this historical material. Maybe I have to be more specific. Thank you. Are you choosing the medium in relationship to the project?
Absolutely.
Which I presume. And for you, Adia, it's like similar. Like, was it the quills that then inspired to go and work larger and in a different scale? So those.
Yeah, for me, I also do performance art, I do music, I do film, and I let the art speak to me, and I let the piece decide what medium it wants to express itself in. So me making a song about consecration to Mary, right, is totally different experience than these these small, intimate images. So for me, I usually let the art tell me how it wants to be expressed. And then I think all of us, we do that pretty well in our practice, right?
Yeah, I definitely don't think we're defined by being, someone who does portraiture, or, we have that variety. I think in my case, there's a huge time gap, right? That was 2011, and I think for all of us as artists, our practice and the mediums and everything do kind of evolve with our life experience. And I think for me, at that point, I wanted to create something that was more contained and small and intimate and was shy on the outside, And I think as I've grown, what I'm wanting to show is more about how we as Black artists can take up space, we can connect to what we imagine our ancestors, in this case, look like, or what we imagine the depth and the color palette and the imagery of a textile or a painting can be now. But then there's also the relationship to craft and the way that I think the art world has shifted in its understanding of craft between 2000 when I got out of school to now, and just evolving with that practice and continuing to honor it as a traditional art form that a lot of us have developed from. Our grandmothers were using this different art form. How do we bring it back and honor it?
I have the microphone still because Curtis, I didn't want to leave you out.
I could also answer that question though too, but if you have something specific for me.
Can you add to your answer how the sonic and your background as a musician also comes in, please?
Yeah, as you said, you let the art dictate. Like, the song tells me how it wants to be sung. The story does. So, as you mentioned, like I think this pandemic that we've experienced or we're experiencing really, pre-pandemic, my exhibition before that was at the Drawing Center with 8 feet by 8 feet paintings and scaffolding and da-da-da-da. And then I spent 3 years in a new country, Germany, away from my family, having with my partner our first child, where everything that I needed to be touch. And so I started with a series of my parents' 70s soca parties in the basement of just recreating their faces and them over and over and over again. And it's really just how the story needs to be, whatever best suits the story. I use the large to counter just the physicality of going like this over and over and over again, and everything gets tight. So at the same time, I'll have a large canvas on the wall that lets me dance, Lawi Dingole. And then it's back to the shy, obsessive kid, So yeah, does that answer? Yeah.
Oh. 2 more.
I'm just going to add one more quick tack on. Also, Curtis, just before the Drawing Center show, you also had an artwork outdoors in the Toronto Biennial. And
Yes.
I wonder if you could just add a little addendum about how that moment of working outside and in a very strange place might have maybe been a part of those shifts also.
Working on side with, so I built, it was called the Juve Temple. And with stonemasons, 2 stonemasons, we were taking, Toronto has had a lot of gentrification, and the Toronto Biennial was trying to speak to indigenous land and these things, but wanted a very, how do I, in this short period of time? I will just focus on the work, not the politics. I constructed a temple that allowed Sir Dingole, and it would be the first of a trilogy of him being able to enter this portal to travel to various locations. One of those locations was being the Drawing Center, and then part of this, what it looked like was a capriccio, an old ancient ruins of what would have been like a 70s disco with the Caribbean wall murals and everything like that. And then part of that installation then, like everything else, always just materials just traveled to the Drawing Center. But I don't think I want to work on that scale again, because the resources needed to build something that grand ended up coming from a gold mining company. So what sense does it make? I'm taking these reclaimed materials from buildings that were destroyed that could have housed people to build these glass condos, that I'm building this temple to talk about, and yet this massive gold mining company sticker ends up on my installation after, and this was something that the biennial didn't speak about with us. So it came down against scale. I don't need to go all out like that to execute an idea all the time, if ever again.
My name is Nico Brier-Aziz. I'm a first-year MFA student, and my question, I think, actually is somewhat related to what you just pointed out, Curtis. All of you touched on just the spiritual aspects to the art-making process, and I really appreciated that. And I was just curious if you all could talk about that more, but particularly in relationship to just as you ascend or rise within your practice, like how you have to navigate the tension of maybe being a part of, that world that's not as, spiritual, not as mindful about some of these issues. And I know you said that, you don't sell your work, but, yeah, like for those who do, like, yeah, how does that navigation look for you within your practice?
I think my music helped me with that, always knowing that there was pop songs and then there was like backpacker music, you know? What you said, that you don't sell your work, I finally came to that place where I'm like, it doesn't have to all be for sale. So I'm so fortunate that there's a part of my practice that I'm fine with going to the fairs, even if it's the Infinity Series, but there are Infinity Series works that are cultural objects to me and my family that will just not enter the market and doesn't need to play that game.
I'll say that I spent probably the first decade of my career in New York and definitely being concerned with what I felt the market wanted. And once I left that and just started to doing installation in my garage, I mean, just was making stuff that I wanted to make, would take a photo and just said, I don't care. And once I got past all of that and started to make work because it was what I wanted to make, that's actually when I started to sell more work. Because I think that's almost like a phase you have to go through of figuring out what your voice is, how can you put it out in the world, and then the letting go, and then maybe some of that spiritual component comes in, or something in your own personal evolution allows you to do whatever comes next.
Okay. Is that it for us? Well, you're going to wrap up, Keely?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there's one more question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I hope it's okay. Oh, I hope it's okay.
Yes.
I just, something that Curtis said earlier really stuck with me and reminded me of what Kijo had said this morning about the myth of archives holding anything in perpetuity. You had said that you didn't care if people held your objects and they broke. Which I think for museum employees and like staff members, that's like a horrible thing to hear. But I love it because I personally, as a former museum employee, recovered museum employee, I would say I love touching objects. I love interacting with objects, and I also love the ephemerality of a lot of objects and a lot of work that's being created. And at the same time, as an art historian, I'm frustrated by the lack of documentation on lives of Black women that I study. And I'm personally just trying to sit with that tension that I feel like your comment kind of aroused in me of how do we as creatives or as curators and museums relax a little bit about the objects that we're carrying, not necessarily as precious things that should never be altered, while also navigating the world we're living in now, because what objects do survive and what objects were preserved were not a part of the Black, not predominantly, were not a part of or did not lend voices to the Black experience. And perhaps where do those stories lie now, if not in objects?
I guess for me, I don't look at them as objects. I look at them as lived experiences. And I think that's one of the issues with museums, right? That they take people's cultural treasures and spiritual works and they look at them as objects. But for me, they're lived experiences. Yeah.
Actually, to quote you, I wrote that down too, that you had said, not to be defined by the archive. I think that was
me.
Is that you?
Yeah.
Okay. And that, I think that's what you're getting at here is like that tension, and also, I mean, I actually call it like the tyranny of the archive. Again, I'm someone who works on public art and murals, and there's so much about, oh, if a mural is like falling apart, you have to go and preserve it. And I always say, well, you know, the artist was speaking to that contemporary moment. That was the point of it being out in public. So maybe it's time for it to go and someone else to put something up there. You know, and again, in our preservationist culture around the arts, you know, that's considered blasphemous. You know, of course we're going to preserve something for ever and ever and ever, even though it was supposed to be a contemporary, current object experience that someone had while walking in their own neighborhood. Now that neighborhood has changed. And in many ways, the voice of those muralists who would have said, yes, change it. I did it 50 years ago, and I hope someone redoes it to speak to their moment. But again, there's the knee-jerk reaction through our museum studies that you must preserve everything.
Is the idea of trust. Like, if I'm always been baby obsessed, and I see a baby, and if the parent can see that I really want to see that baby, here, you want to hold the baby? Yeah, I found that it's almost the same thing. When I pull this out of my pocket, and someone really wants to see it, they take it like this, and they slow down. And it's only little kids who will. But, so it's like, I like that exercise in trust. Because a mad person will come in, but that's life too, this happens. So I like that exercise in trust and hope that that's something I can implement into the viewing of my work as it goes forward.
I think that's it. Thank you so much, all of you.
And I just want to say that these were, including this conversation, incredibly generative and illuminating. And I'm deeply grateful to all of our panelists, our moderators, for sharing with us today. And to all of you for attending, thank you so much, whether you're online or in person. We appreciate your presence and hope that you continue the conversation with us at Next Haven at 5:30. Thanks again.